At the break of dawn, the coliseum was already alive. Its colossal arches caught the faint glow of morning while the stains of yesterday's slaughter clung stubbornly to the stone. Beneath the seating rows, hawkers shouted for attention, pushing baskets filled with olives and diluted wine, preparing for a mob that hadn't even arrived yet. Beyond the iron gates, handlers forced half-starved beasts into their cages. Lions with protruding ribs, elephants stamping the earth in agitation, panthers scraping their claws against metal bars. From the underground tunnels echoed the sharp clatter of steel, not warm-up strikes, but the sound of weapons tested for fresh killing. Above all this, a low murmur thickened into a deafening roar. Tens of thousands of Romans flooding in, eager for the thing their empire perfected more than anyone else. Death turned into entertainment. The Roman arena was never merely sport, it was an experimental ground for cruelty. Emperors filled the sands with naval reenactments, starved wild animals to heighten the drama, and forced prisoners to perform myths that always ended with genuine corpses. None of it was random. It was strategy woven into Rome's machinery of control. The applause from the stands wasn't innocent. It was loyalty made audible, a chorus that echoed across centuries. And today, we're stepping directly into that shadow. These are the most brutal, most inhumane arena spectacles that even Rome itself sometimes considered excessive. From blood-soaked funerary rites to staged executions, we'll uncover how an empire built its authority by transforming agony into applause. So take your seat. The gates are groaning open. The earliest gladiatorial combat in Rome did not begin with imperial grandeur or processions of purple-clad rulers. It started with a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever chose not to honor their Our Father with statues or prayers, but with blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and ordered them to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market heavy with the smell of dung and smoke. This was not sport, it was obligation, a munus, a duty owed to the departed. The roots of this ritual stretched far deeper than Rome. In Campania, warriors had long been slain at graves to appease restless spirits. Over time, the killings shifted into combat. The dead no longer demanded random victims, but battles between selected men. The Samnites, once Rome's enemies, held such contests often, and Roman elites eagerly embraced the custom. Burying a man with riches displayed wealth. Burying him with a blood-drenched spectacle demonstrated dominance. But funerals were only the beginning. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's leaders realized these fights could serve a greater purpose than honoring the dead. They could stabilize politics. Religious festivals, once solemn tributes to Jupiter, began to feature gladiatorial matches. The Senate framed them as acts of devotion, but the public knew the truth. These were state-sponsored displays of violence designed to secure loyalty. Even the fighters' gear told stories. Early combatants wore armor modeled after conquered peoples. The Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with his curved blade, the Gaul with his broad sword. Watching them bleed was watching Rome's conquests replayed in miniature. Death became propaganda, and as blood spilled, the venues expanded. Temporary wooden stands were replaced by permanent amphitheaters, monuments to organized violence where thousands could gather at once. The games no longer belonged to grieving families, they belonged to the state. Each drop of blood carried the same message. Rome held power over men, armies, and even death itself. No one in those early years could have guessed how far it would go. What began as ritual sacrifice morphed into spectacle. What had once been duty became obsession. Rome had discovered a new weapon, control not only over the living, but over the very meaning of dying. And once that door was opened, it was never closed again. The crowd's thunder wasn't always for men. Often it erupted for animals dragged from the farthest reaches of the known world. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes marched across deserts just to die in Rome's arenas. They weren't presented as wonders of nature, but condemned as prey in a carnival of blood. The Romans called these spectacles venationes, hunts. They were not about survival, but domination, proof that the empire could subdue the wild and destroy it for amusement. Julius Caesar set the standard in 46 BC by parading a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. They called it a camelopard, half camel, half leopard, because Rome had no name for such a creature. But names didn't matter. The animal wasn't admired, it was tossed into the sand to be slaughtered. The message was unmistakable. If Rome could capture the strangest creatures alive, then nothing in the world was beyond its grasp. The carnage only escalated. When the Coliseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus oversaw a festival where more than 9,000 animals were reportedly killed. Archaeologists have uncovered bones etched with marks of deliberate starvation, proof that lions and bears were deliberately weakened to guarantee easy, bloody kills. Even elephants, once feared by Roman soldiers when Hannibal unleashed them across the Alps, were herded into the arena and butchered for applause. Behind the scenes, the logistics were as much a part of the spectacle as the slaughter itself. Exotic animals had to be trapped, dragged across Dessay. Arties kept alive just long enough to meet their doom. Caravans hauled cages over blistering sands. Ships ferried them down the Nile. Handlers risked their lives to deliver living trophies to Rome. To see a panther in the wild was already dangerous. To watch one explode from a cage before 50,000 screaming spectators, that was power made visible. Every beast that collapsed on the sand was a souvenir of conquest. A reminder that Rome's reach extended beyond borders into the very heart of the natural world. Some emperors turned these hunts into personal stages. Commodus, Rome's most flamboyant showman, entered the arena dressed as Hercules, slaughtering hundreds of animals himself. He wanted to look like a god towering above the beasts. But everyone could see the truth. He was a fragile man with a bow, protected by handlers and guaranteed victory. The hunts were often rigged, animals chained, crippled or half-starved, so the emperor's triumph was certain. The crowd cheered not from admiration, but because silence could be fatal. Yet behind the roars lay a quieter tragedy. Writers like Pliny the Elder warned that rare species were vanishing from their homelands after decades of Roman slaughter. Lions, leopards and elephants were driven toward extinction to satisfy the empire's hunger for spectacle. The Colosseum was not merely a theatre of death, it was an ecological wrecking ball. But to Rome, extinction meant nothing. What mattered was the illusion that nature itself could be captured, broken and destroyed for fun. Every carcass left on the sand was another brick in the wall of imperial control. Gladiators. The very word still drips with blood and spectacle. To us, they appear as legendary warriors, bronzed skin, flashing steel, standing tall in defiance. But strip away the myth, and the truth of their existence was misery wrapped in iron. Gladiators were not heroes. They were the discarded, the enslaved, the condemned. Their sweat and suffering were Rome's entertainment, their lives auctioned for cheers. The origins of the gladiator schools were as grim as their purpose. Criminals guilty of capital offences, prisoners of war dragged in chains from conquered territories, and even debtors crushed beneath financial ruin, all were thrown into the system. Some volunteered, yes, but not for glory. They signed contracts as octorati, selling their bodies into the arena in exchange for money, gambling that death might be slower than starvation. Once inside, they were property. A gladiator didn't own his body, his freedom, or even the right to die on his own terms. The schools, or ludi, were prisons disguised as training camps. Behind their heavy gates, discipline was absolute. Gladiators were drilled daily in weapon styles. Murmillo with his heavy shield and sword, Retiarius with his net and trident, Secutor with his smooth helmet designed to counter the net fighter. Every pairing was calculated to create balance, suspense, and above all, spectacle. The goal was not simply death, but performance. To bleed beautifully, to die memorably. But training did not mask the brutality of existence. Gladiators slept in cramped barracks, chained to prevent escape. Their meals were heavy on beans and barley, building fat around their bodies, not for health, but so that wounds looked dramatic without being immediately fatal. They were walking canvases for Rome's obsession with pain. And yet, paradoxically, gladiators became celebrities. Their names were etched on tavern walls, their faces painted in graffiti. Women whispered about their scars as marks of masculinity. Roman poets mocked upper-class wives for sneaking into the arms of gladiators, drawn to their raw brutality over the polished stiffness of senators. Even the emperors weren't immune. Commodus styled himself a gladiator, strutting into the arena in silk tunics, demanding the crowd cheer his staged victories. What began as punishment had mutated into fame. Still, most gladiators did not bask in glory. For every fighter adored by the crowd, hundreds more died anonymously, their corpses dragged out through the Porta Libitinaria, the gate of death, their bodies dumped into mass graves without ceremony. The audience did not weep. The sand was raked smooth, the blood concealed, and the games marched on. The imbalance of these fights was often deliberate. Prisoners of war, Gauls, Dacians, Thracians, were forced into the arena against professional gladiators, ensuring their slaughter. Some were even stripped of weapons, handed wooden clubs or nothing at all, expected to face armed killers. This was not combat, it was execution by performance. The spectacle relied on humiliation as much as violence, and executions were where Roman cruelty reached its peak. Noon, when the sun burned hottest and the crowd grew restless, was the hour of the meridiani. Condemned criminals, murderers, rebels, or slaves who dared disobey were marched into the arena. They weren't given the dignity of a duel. Instead, they were forced into grotesque reenactments of myths. One man might play Orpheus, only to be torn apart by trained bears. Another might be cast as Icarus, his wings set aflame as he plummeted to the sand. Hercules' 12 labours were repeated with victims in place of the hero, each ending in mutilation. These weren't plays. They were executions scripted as theatre. The crowd roared not just for blood, but for irony. To see a condemned thief act as Prometheus, his liver devoured by an eagle, was to witness justice transformed into art. Rome did not hide its cruelty, it staged it with poetry. Even women were not exempt. Though rare, female gladiators, gladiatrices, were paraded into the arena for shock value. They fought dwarfs, wild animals, and sometimes each other, their blood staining the sand just as red as men's. Writers sneered at them, mocking the empire for allowing women to abandon modesty, yet the crowds howled with fascination. For Rome, gender was not protection from violence. It was another tool for variety and spectacle. Children, too, sometimes suffered. Historians record instances of boys thrown into the arena as part of mass executions. For the Romans, no boundary was sacred if it could feed the crowd's hunger. The cruelty reached a theatrical climax under emperors like Nero, Domitian, and above all Commodus. Nero forced Christians into the arena, dressing them as mythic villains before lions ripped them apart. Domitian pitted women and dwarfs in bizarre matches, mocking their bodies for entertainment. Commodus, intoxicated with vanity, turned executions into comedy sketches, blinding men before stabbing them or forcing them to wear ridiculous costumes before slaughter. What might have been solemn punishment elsewhere was in Rome a joke, a death played for laughs. The message in all of this was consistent. Rome owned life and death. To defy Rome meant not just to perish, but to perish spectacularly, your agony magnified before the eyes of tens of thousands. Even dying became a performance, and silence in the stands was impossible. The crowd's approval was demanded, their participation essential. They raised their thumbs not to decide life or death, as Hollywood imagines, but to confirm that the state's violence was justified. Every scream, every wound, every severed limb was applause for empire, and for the victims there was no escape, not in life, not in death, not even in memory. Their pain was consumed, then discarded like scraps for the beasts. Rome's power was not just in conquering lands, it was in conquering the human body, reshaping it into theatre. The arena was the empire's mirror, brutal, merciless, unrelenting. And with each passing decade, the cruelty only deepened, preparing the stage for Rome's most deranged experiments in spectacle. The Coliseum was not simply a theatre of combat, it was an empire-sized laboratory of imagination, where blood and suffering became raw material for art. As the centuries advanced, Rome's thirst for novelty pushed the games beyond human duels, beyond animal hunts, into realms so excessive that even Romans whispered of madness. The most audacious of these spectacles were the Naumachii, mock naval battles staged not on rivers or seas, but inside arenas. The first major Naumachia had been arranged by Julius Caesar in 46 BC, when he flooded a specially dug basin and forced 2,000 men and 4,000 oarsmen to slaughter one another in full-scale ship combat. The symbolism was unmistakable. Caesar didn't just rule land, he commanded water itself. But when the Colosseum was built, this fantasy grew wilder. Its arena floor, designed with an intricate system of channels and sluices, could be flooded. Scholars still debate how often this was attempted, but ancient writers describe the sight with awe. Gladiators fighting aboard scaled-down warships, ramming and boarding as thousands screamed overhead. Imagine standing in the stands as triremes, their bronze rams glinting under the sun, crashed into one another, men drowning, arrows raining, sailors screaming. Not only did blood stain the sand, it rippled through water. The logistics were staggering. Vast quantities of water had to be diverted, ships constructed, prisoners trained to row and fight as mariners, only to die before the emperor's gaze. But for Rome, effort was no obstacle. A single day's entertainment could cost the lives of thousands. The state's message was clear. If we can turn oceans into theatre, what can't we control? Yet not even Naumachie satisfied the imperial appetite for cruelty. Executions grew increasingly theatrical. Rome did not merely kill criminals, it forced them to act. Prisoners became unwilling actors in mythological tragedies. A man condemned might play Daedalus only for his wax wings to melt as he plummeted from a contraption high above the crowd. Another would be dressed as Hercules, chained to a pyre, burned alive as the myth demanded. These executions blurred the line between drama and death. Audiences didn't just watch, they consumed morality tales written in agony, performed with human bodies. One infamous example was the myth of Orpheus. According to legend, Orpheus calmed beasts with music. In the arena, a condemned man was dressed as him, given a lyre and surrounded by animals. But instead of falling to his song, the beasts mauled him to death. The crowd laughed at the inversion. Rome took myths and twisted them into irony, using humor as a blade. The cruelty sometimes bordered on parody. Under Emperor Domitian, dwarfs and women were forced into combat, not for fairness, but mockery. Under Nero, Christians were dressed as mythic villains before being torn apart by lions. Martyrdom scripted as theatre. And then came Commodus, whose vanity turned the arena into a circus of absurdity. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, fancied himself Hercules reborn. Draped in lion skins, wielding a club, he stormed into the arena not as emperor, but as performer. He killed hundreds of animals personally, sometimes shooting ostriches with arrows tipped so finely that he decapitated them in one shot. Writers mocked that he would parade before the senators holding a severed ostrich head, grinning as if daring them to laugh. But his true madness lay in human contests. He forced the Roman elite to watch him duel from the safety of the arena, his opponents weakened or disguised. Once he fought men armed only with sponges. Another time he slaughtered men while dressed as Mercury, cracking jokes as they bled. He made Rome's most sacred space a stage for his ego. The Coliseum, once a symbol of imperial majesty, became his personal theatre of madness. Yet even as emperors spiraled into excess, the games carried deeper meaning. To Rome, violence was not random, it was ritualized power. Every execution reaffirmed authority. Every naval battle reenacted conquest. Every scream was proof of dominion. But beneath the spectacle, cracks began to appear. The sheer cost of the games bled the treasury dry. Thousands of animals had to be captured, transported and fed. Gladiators required constant training, housing and medical care. Flooding the Colosseum demanded entire aqueduct systems. An emperor could spend fortunes on a single festival, buying only temporary applause. Behind the cheers lurked economic exhaustion. Philosophers too began to turn against the games. Seneca, who once witnessed an execution, wrote with disgust, "At midday they slaughter men to amuse those who had no appetite for combat. The spectators demand killings, nothing more." To him, the games revealed not strength but decay, proof that Rome's people had grown addicted to cruelty. Even ordinary citizens sometimes recoiled. Stories spread of spectators fainting, of senators leaving in shame, of whispers that the gods themselves disapproved. Christianity, with its reverence for life and disdain for pagan rituals, struck at the heart of gladiatorial culture. To Christians, the arena was not glory but sin. Martyrs who perished there were not disgraced, but sanctified. Slowly, the moral foundation of the spectacles began to erode. By the 4th century AD, as Rome staggered under external invasions and internal corruption, emperors could no longer justify the expense. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, tolerated the games but discouraged them. By the 5th century, the tides had turned. Gladiatorial combat faded, replaced by circus races and theatre. The Colosseum itself fell into neglect, its stones scavenged for churches and palaces. The arena of Deadliest became a ruin, haunted by memory. And yet its shadow never vanished. Even today, when we speak of Rome, the Colosseum rises in the imagination, not as a ruin, but as it was, filled with screams, soaked in blood, a stage where emperors played gods and men perished for applause. The games may have ended, but their lesson lingers. Rome's genius was not in invention or mercy, it was in spectacle, in turning death into theatre, cruelty into ritual, power into entertainment. And perhaps that is why we still stare at those ruins in awe, not because they remind us of greatness, but because they whisper of the human capacity for darkness dressed in glory. The gates of the Coliseum have long since closed, but if you listen closely, past the tourist chatter and camera clicks, you can almost hear it still. The roar of a crowd, the clash of steel, the cries of the condemned. Rome is gone. Its arena remains. Rome's arenas may have crumbled, their stones scattered into the walls of churches and palaces, but the shadow of the Colosseum never faded. The empire died, the emperors vanished, but the hunger for spectacle, the craving to watch others suffer, to cheer for violence disguised as art, lived on. When gladiatorial combat ended in the 5th century AD, it was not because humanity had grown gentler, it was because Rome could no longer afford the luxury of cruelty on such a massive scale. The empire's wealth was gone, its enemies pressed at its gates, and its people hungered for bread more than blood. Yet the instincts the games had nurtured remained alive in the Roman psyche, passed silently into the DNA of European culture. In medieval times, echoes of the arena reappeared in the tournaments of knights. Yes, jousts carried codes of honor, banners and chivalric rules, but beneath the silken heraldry lay the same ancient thrill. Men in armor crashing together, bones breaking, blood spraying, and a crowd roaring approval. Kings and lords praised the spectacle as training for war, but peasants watched for the same reason Romans once had, because violence, when staged, feels like theatre. Public executions carried the legacy even further. In town squares across Europe, scaffolds became miniature arenas. Criminals hanged, beheaded, or burned were transformed into entertainment for ordinary citizens. Parents lifted children onto shoulders to see the condemned suffer, just as Roman fathers once did in the Colosseum. The cruelty of the state was not hidden in shadows, it was displayed under sunlight, dressed in ceremony, swallowed by applause. And in the modern age, the Colosseum's ghost still lingers. We may no longer flood amphitheatres or release lions on chained men, but we pack stadiums, arenas, and rings, screaming for victory and defeat. Professional fighting, boxing, wrestling, mixed martial arts are sanitized descendants of gladiatorial combat. Rules and referees prevent outright slaughter, but the principle is unchanged. Two bodies locked in struggle, watched by thousands, judged by cheers. Even cinema has carried forward the legacy. The blockbuster films of our age, epic battles, war movies, even gladiator reenactments, echo the same rhythms Rome perfected. Violence, when staged, is irresistible. It draws us in, makes us forget morality, makes us cheer for blood that is only pretend. But our ancestors once cheered for blood that was real. Some historians argue that the Colosseum shaped more than entertainment. It shaped psychology. It trained humanity to see violence not only as horror, but as art, as something to consume. To Rome, a death in the sand was not tragedy. It was punctuation in a narrative, applause in a drama. That mindset, once unleashed, was never put back into chains. And yet the ruins remind us of more than cruelty. They remind us of fragility. Empires fall, stones crack, crowds vanish, but memory endures. The Colosseum, stripped of marble and left to crumble, still towers as a warning. Greatness built on cruelty cannot last. Rome mastered the world, but it could not master itself. Its arena fed its ego until the cost devoured it whole. Today, millions walk through the broken arches, tourists clutching cameras where once citizens clutched daggers of approval. They do not see executions, they see history. But if you close your eyes in those ruins, if you imagine the roar of 50,000 voices, you might feel what Romans once felt. That strange intoxication, that mingling of awe and horror, the knowledge that human beings can turn anything, even death itself, into a performance. The Colosseum stands not as a monument to Rome's glory, but as a mirror. A reminder that inside every society, inside every one of us, lies a fascination with spectacle. And the question is not whether we still crave it. The question is whether we have truly outgrown it, or whether, under new disguises, we are still Romans in the stands, cheering as the gates swing open,